I'm here to say about freedom, which people in developed democracies started to take for granted. I have often heard that freedom and human rights are important for sure, but economic benefits, geopolitical interests, and security concerns are even more significant. And that is why developed democracies compromised with authoritarian regimes. They use their cheap labor, their new markets, their natural resources, and thus help them to strengthen. But the fault of this approach is that freedom and peace are inextricably linked. States that grossly violate human rights, persecuted journalists, killed activists, and dispersed peaceful demonstrations, such states poses a threat not just to their own citizens, but to peace and security in general. And one clear example is Russia, which destroyed its own civil society step by step. But for a long time, developed democracies turned a blind eye for this. They continued to shake Putin's hands, they built gas pipelines and carried on business as usual. And the world scarcely blinked only of Crimea annexation by military force, which was unprecedented in post-war Europe. And now, as a human rights lawyer, I am in a situation when the law doesn't work. Russian troops are deliberately destroying residential buildings, schools, churches, museums, and hospitals. They attack in evacuation corridors. They torturing people in filtration camps. They forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia in order to bring them up as Russians. They ban Ukrainian language and culture. They are abducting, robbing, raping, and killing civilians in the occupied territories. And the entire UN system of peace and security can't stop it. Let me share with you just one story from 80,000 which we have documented. This is a story of 10-year-old boy Ilya Matviichuk from Mariupol. When Russian troops circled city, they didn't allow International Committee of Red Cross to open green corridors and to evacuate civilians from there. So Ilya and his mother, like other people in Mariupol, have to hide in the basement of their building from the Russian shelling. They melted snow in order to get water, and they made fires to cook at least some food. But when supplies ran out, they were forced to go out, and suddenly they appeared in the center of Russian shelling. Ilya's mother was injured in her head, and the boy's leg was torn. With the last strength, his mother took her son to the friend apartment. In this friend apartment, they just laying on a couch and hugging each other because it was no medical assistance. Prior to this, Russians deliberately destroyed maternity hospital and entire medical infrastructure in the city. So they lying like this for several hours. And this 10-year-old boy, Ilya, told to my colleague that his mother died and got frozen right in his arms. I have a question. How we people who live in 21st century will defend a human being? Their life, their freedom, their human dignity? Can we rely on the law? Or does just brutal force matter? And the answer to this question is important not just for people in Ukraine or people in Iran, China, Sudan, or Nicaragua. The answer to this question will define our common future. We must rethink our approach to freedom. We must rethink our approach to global security. Because global security, it's first and foremost, is human security. and human security is impossible without freedom. What is the situation with freedom in the world? Half of population in the world this year goes to election. But don't be an illusion. More than 80% of people live in non-free or partially free societies. It means that people who have a real right to vote for whom they want to vote, that have a real right to say what they think, have a real right to love whatever their hearts tell them to love, or have a real right to choose whom gods they want to pray, are the minority. And the problem is not in the fact that in authoritarian countries, the space for freedom is shrinking to the size of the prison cell. The problem is that in developed democracies, the forces calling into doubt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gain weight. And there is a clear reason for this. Because coming generations replace those ones who survived after the Second World War. They inherited freedom and democracy from their parents. They have never fought for it. They don't understand their meaning. They become consumers of democracy. They start to perceive freedom as a possibility to make a choice between cheeses in supermarket. And that's why they very easily exchange their freedom for economic benefits, for geopolitical interests, for security concerns, and first and foremost, for their own comfort. Yes, comfort is important, but freedom is very fragile. You can't attain freedom once and forever. We every day make our choice, and only determination to act define a society with a future. I want to raise on several points. First, we are dealing with the formation of entire authoritarian bloc. I live in Kiev, and my native city, like thousands of other Ukrainian cities, are constantly being shelled not just by Russian rockets, but also by Iranian drones. China helps Russia to circumvent sanctions and import technologies critical to warfare. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells. Syria votes for Russia in UN General Assembly. Russia, China, Syria, North Korea, Iran are very different countries. I mean, this regime have something in common. All these regimes which captured power in these countries have the same idea of what a human being is. Authoritarian regimes perceive people as an object of control. They deny them in their rights and freedoms. Democracies, in opposite, see a human being, their rights and freedom to be a highest value. And there is no way to negotiate it. Because only existence of free world always provides a threat to dictatorship to lose their power. And if authoritarian regimes help each other, democracies for sure have to demonstrate unity in defending their values. Second, to prevent wars, we need justice. The 20th century brought millions of deaths and the dehumanization of humankind, which reached its most concrete form in Holocaust. Responsibility for what had been perpetrated was codified in the slogan, "Never again." Governments created UN systems and signed international treaties. The idea that every person is free and equal in their rights and dignity came to characterize the new post-war humanism. Meanwhile, the totalitarian Gulag have never condemned or punished for all atrocities, deportation of indigenous people, forced collectivization, artificial famine, millions of repressions, and erosion of national identity. And that is why, in Russia, the end of the Second World War is celebrated with the slogan, "We can repeat." There is a clear difference. Never again, and we can repeat. And thus, evil keeps coming back. the destruction of Grozny in Chechnya, a city of 500,000 people, the Russian bombardment of Aleppo in Syria, and the firebombing in Mariupol in Ukraine, and the bodies of people killed on the streets of Bucha. Unpunished evil grows. Russian troops committed terrible crimes in Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Mali, Libya, Syria, other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. If we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish states and their leaders who start such wars in the present. It's a common sense. But in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such a precedent. It was Nuremberg trials. All other trials which you probably heard, like Yugoslavia or Rwanda, tribunals or special courts in Sierra Leone, it was courts where people were judged because they kill each other not according to the norms. But all atrocities which we are now documenting, it's a result of their leadership decision to start the war. And because we have only such precedent as Nuremberg trials, we still look to the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trials. It was a victorious trial. I remind that it was a trial when Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. But we live in a new century. Justice must be independent and not put into dependence of how and when this war will end, which means we cannot wait. We have to change the global approach to crimes against peace. We must establish a special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and other criminals accountable. Third, we have entered a period of turbulence. I don't know how historians in future will call this historical time. The world order based on UN Charter and international law is collapsing before our eyes. The international peace and security system established after the Second World War provided unjustified indulgences for certain countries. Its cope more or less well with the global challenges before, but now it is stalling and reproducing ritualistic movements. The work of Security Council is paralyzed. And now it's easy to predict that such fires like wars will emerge more and more often in different parts of the globe because the whole international wiring is faulty and sparks are everywhere. And because there are a lot of authoritarian leaders who try to challenge this system and change the world order to gain benefits for them by force. And that is why Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, it's not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Putin attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, rule of law, human rights and freedom are fake values because they couldn't protect anyone during the war. Putin attempts to convince that a state with a strong military potential and nuclear weapons can break international order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly change the internationally recognized borders. And if Putin succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe to do the same. What does it mean for developed democracies? The democratic governments will be obliged to invest money not in healthcare, not in education, culture, or business development, not in solving global problems like climate change or social inequality, but in weapons. We'll witness an increase in the number of nuclear states just in dozens of years. We'll witness an emergence of new weapons of mass destruction, robotic armies, and using AI as a method of war. If Putin succeeds, and this scenario comes true, we all find ourselves in a world which will be dangerous for everyone, without any exceptions. Fourth, democracies must win wars. I regularly participated in different international platforms. And sometimes I have to remind very simple thing, that people in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else, because it's us who are dying. We want peace. We don't want war. But peace doesn't come when a country which was invaded stops fighting. That's not peace. That's occupation. And occupation is the same war, but just in another form. Occupation is not just changing one state flag to another. Occupation means enforced disappearances, rape, torture, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. Russia is using terror against civilians to keep the occupied territories under their control. The Russian military and special forces physically exterminated active local people on the ground. Priests, journalists, mayors, teachers, environmentalists, children writers, musicians, any active people of community. They forcibly taken Ukrainian children to Russia to bring them up in Russian education camp, and then these children supposed to be adopted by Russian families. They deliberately destroyed and robbed Ukrainian cultural heritage. People under occupation have no way to protect their rights, their freedom, their property, their children, and their beloved ones. The occupation doesn't reduce human suffering. Occupation just makes human suffering invisible. And I spoke to hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia, they were compelled to write something with their own blood. One woman told me how her eye was dug out with a spoon. There is no legitimate reason in doing such things. There is also no military necessity for this. Russians have done these horrible things only because they could. So we cannot leave people in occupied territories for torture and death. Because sustainable peace, it's a freedom to live without fear of violence and to have a long-term perspective. Russia is an empire, and how Volodymyr Yermolenko brightly described today, empire has a center but has no borders, which means that if empire has energy, empire always tries to expand. We interviewed people who survived Russian captivity, and they told us how Russians perceive the future. They publicly tell them that first we'll occupy Ukraine, and then together with you we will go to conquer in other countries. The process of forcible mobilization of Ukrainian citizens to Russian army is going on all these years on the occupied territories. So regardless whether or not European countries and developed democracies in other parts of the globe have the courage to admit it or not, they are safe only because Ukrainians still fighting, still continue resistance of Russian aggression. Because if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, Russia will go further. And last thing which I want to mention. Fifth, people can make the history. I have been working with the law for many years, and I know when you can't rely on the legal instruments, you can still rely on people. We get used to look to the world and think in the categories of states and interstate organizations, but ordinary people have a much great impact than they can even imagine. And Ukraine is a clear example, because when large-scale war started, I was in Kiev. I refused to evacuate, and I witnessed how international organizations evacuated their personnel, like international governments. But ordinary people remained. And ordinary people started to do extraordinary things. It were ordinary people who took people out from the ruined cities. It were ordinary people who helped to survive under artillery's fire. It were ordinary people who broke through the encirclement to provide humanitarian aid, and suddenly it became obvious that ordinary people fighting for their freedom and their human dignity are stronger than even the second army in the world. I would never wish anyone to go through our experience, because war probably is the most horrible thing which just can happen. But it's the always right thing to fight for freedom. And these dramatic times provide us opportunity to reveal the best in us, to be courageous, to fight for freedom, to make a difficult but right choices, to take burden of responsibility, and to help each other. Because only when we help in each other, only in that moment we are acutely aware what does it mean to be a human. And I'm here to say that despite everything, the story of Ukraine, it's a life-affirming story, because this is a dramatic times that raise hope. Because when freedom is denied, it's become powerfully break out. Because future is unclear but not pre-written. And we still have a chance to fight for freedom and for future, which we want for ourselves and for our own children. And this is a huge luxury to have such a chance. Thank you.